Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we are going to explore the stories of different ancient objects that are mysterious and raise questions. Questions about why they exist, what their practical or symbolic functions were, or sometimes about how they arrived where they were found. First, I will tell you about the Roman Dodecahedrons, found in various places of the Roman Empire in large numbers. These dodecahedrons are small objects with 12 sides, as their name indicates, but we do not know why they were made in antiquity. Many theories abound. We will also go to Scotland to talk about mysterious carved stone balls from the Stone Age, and to Costa Rica in Central America to talk about almost perfect stone spheres that are centuries old. And I will also discuss a set of chess pieces, the Lewis Chessmen, that are kept in Scotland, where they were found, and at the British Museum. The mystery here is how they arrived, probably from Norway. Apart from that story, they are also the most comprehensive set of medieval chess pieces we know of, which is an occasion to delve into the history of that game and how it arrived in the West. So we have a lot of things to explore. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. If you join our Patreon, which is possible for as little as $3.50, you will gain access to 16 exclusive episodes, and we do add a new one every month. And you can listen and download all the episodes with and without background sounds. You also get advanced releases on Fridays instead of Sundays, surveys, and obviously, this is the best way to let us know your feedback, requests, and wishes about Lights Out Library. And because we believe in keeping things simple and fair, while our starter plan begins at $3.50 monthly, here's the wonderful part. Everyone who joins our community gets access to absolutely everything we offer, regardless of what they're able to chip in. Whether you can contribute a little more or stick with a basic amount, you'll enjoy the same perks because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options, which may be better suited for you. You will find them in the description of the episode. But before we begin, let's take a moment together to prepare for our journey ahead. If you'd like, gently close your eyes and let your daily concerns drift away. Find a position that feels natural and cozy. Perhaps make adjustments until you're perfectly comfortable. Now, draw in a deep, nourishing breath, and as you release, do it slowly. Notice how your body responds. Feel the warmth flowing from your shoulders down through your neck, melting away any tension. Let your facial muscles become soft, your jaw loose, your fingers naturally open, and your legs completely at ease. as you settle into this peaceful state, my voice will be your gentle companion as we begin our exploration together. And now, let's begin tonight's journey with our first part, the one about Roman dodecahedrons. What are they exactly? A dodecahedron is an object with 12 faces, and these Roman dodecahedrons are relatively small, about 1.5 to 4 inches in diameter. That is 4 to 10 centimeters. They are made of bronze and they are hollow. Each face has a hole in the middle, so 12 holes in total of varying sizes, and each corner of the object has a little protruding knob. So why are these objects mysterious? Because we don't know why they exist. They were not easy to make, with all these details and their regular shapes, but they don't seem to serve any function, practical or symbolic. The first ones were unearthed in the 18th century, and since then more than 100 have been found, at least 130 that are in various museums and collections. They were found mostly in the north and the west of the Roman Empire, in Great Britain, France, Germany, the Benelux, Switzerland, Hungary, and they were dated to the later period of the Roman Empire, from the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD. They are often in rather good state, because the bronze they are made of is a copper alloy, and it resists well the passing of time. But as soon as the first dodecahedrons were discovered, the question of why they existed was raised. And since then, no solid, definitive answer has been found. There is no known mention of them in contemporary accounts, no pictures left by the ancient Romans, and this suggests that they were not so important in Roman society. But this leaves us with few clues. We only have a collection of hypotheses. So what could these dodecahedrons have been? A first possibility is that they would have been used as knitting devices, more precisely spool knitting. Spool knitting is the use of a spool with different nails or pegs around the rim to produce a fabric shaped like a tube. So in that hypothesis, the dodecahedrons would have been antique spools, and it looks technically possible, with the knobs around the dodecahedrons and the holes in each face to possibly pass thread, even though no one precisely knows how it could have been possible to knit with these objects. But why not? So that's the first hypothesis. But there are various objections to it. Firstly, the earliest historical records that attest to spool knitting appeared much later, in the 16th century, and there are no signs at all that the Romans or anyone in antiquity used that kind of device to knit. And secondly, it would be peculiar to make such tools in bronze if they were destined for knitting. Bronze was not super precious in ancient Rome, but like all metals, it was costly, costlier than wood, and wood would have been an obvious choice to make a spool. It would have been solid and easier to work with, much cheaper and also lighter to manipulate, so it doesn't seem like a very sound hypothesis. And that brings us to a second one. The dodecahedrons could have been weapons, for example, used as projectiles, or as the head of a mace connected to a handle, or to a chain that was connected to a handle. Not a very credible hypothesis either, according to experts, and it is quite obvious why. The dodecahedrons are hollow, and so they are rather light. They are also often too small to serve as the head of a mace, since they are often only 2 to 3 inches in diameter. So they would make very poor weapons. That's not a real good explanation. Another hypothesis of a different nature, the third one, is that they could have been religious artifacts, which would explain their apparent absence of practical use. But at the same time, their relative complexity and an apparent aesthetic preoccupation in their making. This is a possibility. It is a bit strange that no record would mention them in the rituals of any cult. But strange doesn't mean impossible. We often have little information about the practices and precise beliefs of many antique cults within the Roman Empire. There was a secretive and popular cult of Mithra in ancient Rome, and we don't know that much about this cult beyond what the temples, the shrines look like, or a few iconographic elements found in these shrines. What could bring credibility to the religious meaning, the religious function of the dodecahedrons, is that they were found in previously Celtic provinces of the Roman Empire in the UK, France, the Benelux, Germany, or Hungary. These regions had large Celtic populations at some point, even though they had later been replaced by Germanic peoples when the Romans arrived. But still, it could be a cult born of these Romanized Celtic societies in Gaul or Roman Britain, which would explain why the dodecahedrons were all found in Western and Central Europe, and not in other parts of the empire like the Middle East, Greece, Italy, Spain, or North Africa. So if they were religious artifacts, maybe these dodecahedrons had a forgotten symbolic meaning to the followers of this cult or these cults. Or maybe they could have been fortune-telling devices, even though this is purely speculative, and we have no idea how they would have been used to predict the future. But possibly like big dice, they would have been thrown to see on which face they rested. So, this religious or divinatory function is a possibility, but it is unproven. Yet another hypothesis, number 4, is that they would simply have been decorative objects or parts of toys for children. It is hard to believe they were parts of toys, because no known Roman toys used these shapes or would have used metal parts like these. And if they were toys, why the presence only in some regions of the empire? So probably not toys, but their use as decorative objects is possible. Still, that would be something surprising from Romans or from Romanized populations. Surprising because the Romans did produce decorative objects, but these objects had a function first and foremost: vases, lamps, plates, jewels, furniture. There were no examples of Roman objects that were made with the only purpose of serving as abstract decoration. An object that cannot be connected to a function or that doesn't have at least a symbolic meaning. actually producing and mass producing decorative objects that only exist for their aesthetic or decorative qualities and nothing else, is a particularity of modern times. This is not something older cultures did, even when they produced a large number of ornaments and decorations. These were not necessarily useful, but they were applied to useful objects that were decorated: furniture, clocks, lamps. Decorative objects did not exist by themselves like works of art, and it would be a stretch to imagine the Romans producing these dodecahedrons as conceptual works of art. This would sound very anachronistic, and there would be no other known example across the Roman world. So not toys, and the hypotheses of the dodecahedrons as decorative objects with no other function than that of ornament. That sounds very unlikely. Now, hypothesis number 5. What if they were some kind of measuring device? The holes of different sizes in the faces could have been used to insert a handle or a stick, and they would have been some sort of tool for surveyors. There again, not completely impossible, but it sounds complicated because there is never any graduation or inscription on the dodecahedrons, which should have been the case if they were used to measure distances. In general, one element that goes against the idea that the dodecahedrons were objects of everyday life is that they were sometimes found with coins, and this suggests that they were considered as valuable objects. Not always, but several of them were found like this in coin hoards, so maybe they were precious or had something to do with coins. Throughout the Roman Empire, metallic coins were widely used as currency. However, when these coins were minted from precious metals, there was always a risk that people would clip or shave off portions of the metal, diminishing their value. So, the holes in the different faces of the dodecahedron could have been used to quickly check the diameter of coins, and that would explain the different sizes of the holes, even though here again that sounds like a stretch. Why have no inscription on any of the faces? Why make such a complicated object for a measuring function? Something that could have been achieved much more easily by putting different holes on a single sheet of metal, for example. So it doesn't really seem that dodecahedrons were made for this. Which brings us to the latest possible function. The 7th hypothesis that I personally find more compelling than the others, even though it's not proven either. These dodecahedrons could have been voluntarily complicated objects designed to test the skills of blacksmiths. Roman urban society in the period we are considering, the 2nd to 4th century AD, this urban society was structured by associations, guilds called collegia, collegium in the singular. These collegia, these societies, were not limited to professionals. They worked like social clubs or religious collectives whose members shared a common interest and worked together to pursue it. It could cover many aspects of urban life, including cult practices, political activities, or offices, professions. So, in a sufficiently large city, there would be many different collegia, including for people of the same profession, that found in these associations a place to socialize. to be with their peers, to collude in the fixation of prices probably. These skills were certainly not very consumer-friendly, but they would also offer a number of guarantees to their clients too. A professional member of a collegium had to respect certain standards of quality or expertise fixed by the collegium. So it is not impossible that in order to judge the capacity of craftsmen to reach a certain status within the collegium, they would be asked to produce a complicated object corresponding to certain specifications. And once the object had been made, it could be shown to clients like a trophy as proof of competence, the know-how, the skill of the craftsman. And that could be a good explanation here, because these dodecahedrons were not easy to make at all. They required the different pieces to be precisely assembled. All 12 faces had to have the exact same dimensions. Otherwise, the dodecahedrons could not be completed. And so the range of skills necessary to make one is impressive. It takes a capacity to melt, shape, and assemble metal parts that have to be precisely calibrated. And that would also explain different things, the apparent value of the objects. Because to blacksmiths who would have made them, it would have been proof of accomplishments, of skills, including of social validation among their peers. Also, the apparent absence of function and the useless complexity of these objects makes sense if the function of the object was not in its use, but in its making, as a tangible proof of someone's skills. So this is a possibility. Dodecahedrons would have been part of a standard portfolio of creations that blacksmiths in some regions of the Roman Empire to the west and the north had to master in order to reach a certain level in their respective collegia. Still, it is just a guess and not a fact, and to this day no definite proof of what the dodecahedrons really served for or meant has really emerged. Do you have a favorite hypothesis? Or maybe you have a new hypothesis to propose. It would definitely be an interesting conversation to be had. Maybe come back tomorrow or another day and add in the comments if you wish to. I think we would all be interested in reading them. Our second set of objects takes us to Scotland, where a majority of them were found. I'm going to tell you about the mysterious petrospheres, the carved stone balls. These balls are not exclusive to Scotland. Some are found in England and others in Ireland, but the majority were discovered in northeast Scotland. More than 400 are known, and a few more are occasionally unearthed. Obviously, this suggests that these balls were once rather abundant, probably in the thousands. When exactly? They have been dated to a relatively long period of time in the late Neolithic, that's more than 5,000 years ago, to at least the Bronze Age, which ended about 3,000 years ago. What do these balls look like? Most are round, but a few are oval, and their appearance varies from almost featureless, with the exception of a few knobs on their surface, often 6 per ball, but it can be less, or sometimes many more. A few balls have dozens of knobs, and they were carved in different types of rock. Their sizes also vary. but the majority are about 7 centimeters in diameter, a bit less than 3 inches. So you can imagine something about the size of a tennis ball, even though a few ones are larger than that. Many are also decorated. They are carved, sometimes heavily, with lines forming circles, spirals, or patterns of straight lines. So they are different in sizes and shape, with varying numbers of knobs in appearance with their decorative features. They were dated from an extended period of time that lasted many centuries, and yet they clearly form a group. They all come from a precise region of the world. And this kind of Neolithic or Bronze Age carved stone balls were not found anywhere else in the world. And they present a mystery. Like the Roman Dodecahedrons, even though they are several centuries older. Why do the stone balls exist? What were they made for? Here again, there are many possibilities that all bring us back to the late prehistoric and antique societies that carved these balls. Before the Roman conquest, the population of Britain all the way north to Scotland was Celtic. But the balls are older than that, older than the presence of the Celts. The first Celts arrived in Great Britain in the 2nd millennium BC, and more migrated to the island in the 1st millennium BC, during the Iron Age. Before them, Britain already had inhabitants, including the ones who left megalithic sites like Stonehenge. And not everything is known about them, but they left abundant archaeological remains. In particular, Britain was populated by a people belonging to the Bell Beaker culture. Beaker or Bell Beaker is the name given to the pre-Celtic culture that is known for their decorative patterns, especially on pottery. This is where the name came from. And the Bell Beaker folk lived in temperate regions of Europe, not just in Great Britain, and they were probably not alone, as Europe had been populated by small groups of prehistoric men for tens of thousands of years. A well-known trace of this late Neolithic human presence in Scotland is the site of Skara, an elaborate stone village where people lived thousands of years ago. And actually, some of the carved stone balls were found at Skara. That's how ancient these stone balls are. But what about their reason to be? Were they made for practical reasons or something more symbolic or ceremonial? If it was for ceremonial use, we have several possibilities. One could be that they were like these sticks that give people the right to speak in discussions. Holding the ball would have given someone the right to be heard, and the ball would have passed from hand to hand. It would have fit well in a hand with its size, which, as I said, was like a tennis ball. That does sound like a lot of effort to create an alternative to a talking stick. Any other object would have worked, but why not? Or maybe they could have been used for divination, like the dodecahedrons we talked about before. They could have been rolled, and the message would have come from their positioning when they rested. Or maybe their function was something more down to earth. They could have been weapons, projectiles in particular. The knobs and the interspaces on each ball would have made it possible to tie them with leather and use them as bolas. Bolas are a type of throwing weapon made of weights that are placed at the end of cords. The weights made it possible to throw the bolas and capture animals because the cords of the bolas entangled their legs. This is possible. The size and weight of the balls are coherent with this use. But signs of ancient use of bolas were mostly found in America, not so much in Great Britain. And if they were used as weapons, why such care in the ornamentation of the balls? When we have plenty of examples of other objects, other weapons and tools of the same period, they were generally not decorated like that. Still, if we assume they were used as weights, it could have been for fishing, tied to nets to make them sink as intended, or as weights for looms. Fishing nets and looms were common in the Bronze Age. But here again, it doesn't explain the care in the making of so many of these balls when simple stones could have done the same job without effort. Fishing or looming were everyday activities, basic activities that didn't justify fancy equipment. The decoration and the uniformity in size could suggest that the balls had a more prestigious or more important use than that. And yet another hypothesis is that they were part of a system of weight measurement. That would explain that they look calibrated, with many balls about the same size. But it doesn't really work either, because the balls have similar sizes, but they are made of different stones and their weights are very different. Maybe it was much simpler than that and they were just part of a game, a balls game, which would explain the need for balls of a similar size to make sets. One last practical suggestion is that they could have been used as ball bearings for transporting big stones. Many of the balls were found in the proximity of Neolithic, megalithic circles, big stones arranged in circles that are typical of the late Neolithic period in Western Europe, including Scotland. These big stones had to be moved, and sometimes they came from rather far, like in the case of Stonehenge. We don't always know exactly how they were displaced from quarries that could be miles or tens of miles away. There are different possible methods that would have worked, like putting them on sledges, rolling them on logs, and why not? Rolling them on these balls, possibly arranged in line inside a wooden hollow log that would have rolled, and with one or two more, maybe supported a big stone. This is not proven, but it is another possibility. At this point, though, none of these explanations dominate, and the carved stone balls keep all their mystery. Our next set of objects will take us to Central America, more precisely to Costa Rica. Almost a century ago, part of the jungle was being cleared for banana plantations, and at some point, large stones began to appear on the ground, invisible from above because they were submerged by the vegetation. These stones were obviously not natural. They were almost perfectly spherical, some very polished, others rougher, and they were of varying sizes, from a few inches in diameter up to over 6 feet, and more than 15 tons. These workers clearing the forest did not know it yet, but they had discovered remains of an ancient culture. Remains created long before the Spanish conquest that had spent centuries hidden under the jungle, waiting to be rediscovered. The spheres are made of different rocks, some basalt-like and others of sedimentary rocks like limestone and sandstone. The spheres can be very heavy, and they appear to have been made from boulders that were hammered with other rocks to give them the spherical shape and then polished with sand. The quarry for the spheres was found several kilometers away from the site of their discovery. And this was proven by the discovery of unfinished spheres on this quarrying site. In total, over 300 of these petrospheres are known. But who made them and why? The first question, who, has a rather precise answer. The spheres were attributed to an extinct culture, the Dikis culture. Even though Mesoamerican civilizations and peoples like the Aztec, the Toltec, the Maya are more famous, or to the south in South America, the Inca, all of South and Central America were populated at the time of the Spanish conquest, and they had been populated for thousands of years. Between Panama and Costa Rica, the dominant culture of the last centuries before the invasion was a Chiriquí culture, also known as the Varaguas culture, which is little known. It didn't leave large ruins or writings, but the quality of its crafts, and especially gold work, is noticeable. This culture went extinct in the 16th century, and it can be traced back to 700 AD. That is to say, 800 years before the arrival of the Spanish. The Dikis who made the spheres were part of the Chiriquí culture. They were a local variant in Costa Rica. It is hard to know when the spheres were created, because the one method used to date stones traditionally is stratigraphy, the observations of layers of sedimentation. When rock is taken to another location and the culture that made the artifacts disappear, you are left with very little information. So the spheres were dated using the information in their environment, because the sites where they were found contained at the same time a settlement with housing, probably permanent. It was a village or a town, and a cemetery with tombs, and also artificial mounds and remains of monumental architecture. Based on all this, the spheres were dated to 680 AD for the oldest ones, but the majority would have been carved and brought to the site after the year 1000, corresponding to medieval times in Europe. After the decline and disappearance of the last representatives of the Dikis culture, the sites where they had lived were completely forgotten and submerged, invaded by the jungle, as happened to Maya cities hundreds of miles to the north. So without any information about the intentions of the Dikis, we are left to guess what these spheres meant to them and why they really went out of the way to create and gather them. Clearly, with such a size, the spheres had no practical use. We can eliminate this possibility, and that means that they must have had a symbolic or aesthetic or religious meaning. One problem is that many spheres were moved shortly after the discovery, so their exact positioning, as it was intended by their creators, remains speculative. This information was lost. But one possible explanation is that they tried to replicate symbolically in our world. our realm of existence, what they saw in the heavens above them. In various pre-Columbian cultures, from North to Central America, it has been hypothesized that this was a theme of inspiration. In previous stories, I told you about the cities of the Maya or Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. These are just examples in which the builders could have been inspired by a drive to replicate, in architecture and urbanism, the otherworldly or ideal world they imagined or envisioned in the sky. In their conception, this could have helped install a form of harmony, a connection between different worlds. And so, the spheres in that case could have been placed to represent the sky constellations with stars of different sizes, or other celestial bodies, for example, various stages of the sun and the moon. The stages of the moon could have been replicated by burying more or less the spheres into the ground. On top of being a symbolic installation, the collection of spheres could also have marked the entrance of houses or various public buildings, possibly with their sizes saying something of the status of people who lived near them. Given that we don't know much about the way the Diki's society worked, it is all hypothetical. And because the spheres have this part of mystery, they have been attributed qualities that they don't have. For example, they are perfect in roundness. It is like for the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, which some people say was perfectly adjusted to building standards that were not known to be accessible to humans at the time of its building. But in both cases, this is just not true. These are myths. The spheres of Costa Rica are well made and do look round, but many of them are imprecise. They are not perfectly round. And some of them, the largest ones, can lack several centimeters in diameter, up to 2 inches, confirming that they were made manually with fairly basic tools to hammer and measure them. In any case, they have become a national symbol in Costa Rica and a source of inspiration for artists, especially sculptors. And now, let's return to Scotland for our last series of objects. These ones are not made of bronze or stone, but ivory, walrus ivory, the material that the tusks of walruses are made of. In 1831, on the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides Islands, northwest of Scotland, a hoard was discovered that contained 94 objects, including 14 tablemen, which are pieces for table games like backgammon, and 78 chess pieces. One complete set of chess pieces contains 16 pieces twice, so that's 32 in total. And here there were 78, so they belong to different sets. It is still unclear whether the hoard contained one or several complete sets, or if the pieces came from different sets and none was complete. Based on the different aspects of the pawns, it has been suggested that these pieces could belong to at least 5 different sets. Apart from pawns, of which there were 19, the majority of pieces are the powerful pieces. There are 8 kings, 8 queens, 16 bishops, 15 knights, and 13 rooks. This was an archaeological treasure because every single one of these pieces was ancient. But even at the time when these pieces were made, the sets they came from were already precious. The dating of these pieces based on the ivory and the style of the figures indicate with a high probability that they are medieval, at some point around the late 12th century or a little bit later, and that they probably came from Norway. First, because carvings of a similar style were manufactured at the city of Trondheim at the time in Norway. But even more because of some of the pieces themselves. The rooks are not little castles or towers as we are used to, but they are warriors, Scandinavian berserkers, and this way of representing rooks was typical of Scandinavia at the time. To understand it a bit better, we need to talk about the spread of the game of chess until it reached Europe. Chess became very popular across medieval Europe among the elite, but for Europe at the time, it was a new game. As you may know, chess was first developed in India, and at the time the pieces were represented a bit different. What would become the bishop was an elephant, and the rook was a chariot. In Persian, rook means chariot. The game traveled westward from India to the Islamic world, where the Persian name rook for chariot was adopted. But instead of continuing with figurative pieces, artisans and players from the Islamic world made them evolve towards abstraction. For a part because it could look more serious, maybe, but also because figurative art depicting people or animals was very frowned upon or forbidden in Islam. So there are examples of chess sets, Arabic or Persian, with all the pieces turned to abstractions. They look like little domes, triangles, different shapes that helped identify the pieces. From the Islamic world, the game reached medieval Europe, and its appearance was transformed again, with most of the pieces returning to being figurative once more. The ex-elephant became a bishop to Christianize the game a bit. Kings and queens and knights were represented as persons or animals again, and the rook, the chariot, became a tower, but not everywhere. For some time in Scandinavia, the rook was pictured as a warrior. In these particular sets of Lewis, a berserker, a warrior in a state of trance, of fury. We know it because they are represented biting their shields, a detail that came straight from ancient Norse sagas, at least as they were told in the 12th century. Actually, the design of the Lewis chess pieces also reveals a lot of things. First, there is a uniformity of style, even though they belong to different sets. It appears that these pieces were crafted by one or several people who worked together, following the same style. And second, the designs are not that serious. The eyes or the attitude of the pieces reveal a touch of comedy or a slightly cartoonish approach, which has crossed the centuries and that can still be understood today. So, with all these elements in mind, what could have been the story of these pieces begins to take shape. They most probably came from Norway, where they were crafted using walrus ivory, a relatively precious material. For more ordinary objects, including games, wood would have been the material of choice. So the material itself and the care put into their making tell us that these pieces were upscale objects or luxury objects. They could have been gathered by a collector or a merchant who would have crossed the North Sea and lost them, or who would have been stolen from near the coasts of Scotland. This is purely speculative, and the history of these pieces is unknown. We cannot even be sure that they stayed for a long time in Lewis before they were discovered. Maybe they were hidden there only for a few years or decades before their discovery, and they traveled much more before. In any case, these pieces are an extraordinary door to the past. They exist because the game of chess was invented thousands of miles away in India. It traveled for centuries, changing aspects and reaching Scandinavia, where it was adapted to local culture. The iconography they reference also tell us of another chapter of human history. Berserkers were represented biting their shields, not as a comical idea, the detail added by the sculptor, but because in the Norse sagas there were about to be put in writing by Christianized authors, especially one from Iceland called Snorri Sturluson. Berserkers were depicted as biting their shields, so this little detail alluded to centuries of Norse mythology and tales that by the end of the 12th century were fading away, falling into oblivion as the culture of Nordic countries was shifting. We know the pieces are no older than the 12th century because of details in their design. For example, the ceremonial headdresses of the bishops, the mitres, changed over time. And the ones depicted on these pieces are typical of the late 12th century or early 13th century. The Lewis chess pieces are not the oldest ones we know of, but they are by far the most comprehensive set of ancient European pieces, because even if they may not form a single complete set, I told you earlier that this is uncertain how many sets there were in these hoards. Other pieces of medieval chess were found isolated or in very small sets. Nothing has reached us as coherent as the Lewis ones. And so, with their funny and well-crafted shapes, their unknown tribulations, they are a window to the history of medieval Europe and of the game of chess. They can be seen at the British Museum, where a majority of the pieces are kept, or at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. So are the other artifacts we spoke about tonight. The dodecahedrons are kept in various European museums. The carved stone balls in various museums in the UK and Ireland. And the stone spheres, if you go to Costa Rica, are also displayed on site and at the Museo Nacional de Costa Rica. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you, as always, to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.